It is windy out here. Well, that's okay. And I'm sitting here with my cup of coffee. I say sitting, clearly I'm walking, but I'm gonna jump in my car real quick. Because it was ever so important that I come and get a cup of coffee. But you know what? Let's take a minute to talk about what it is to have a cup of coffee. You see, when I say a cup of coffee, I'm using what in Latin would be a genitive to modify the cup. I'm describing what kind of cup it is. I'm being much more specific, as it were, about what is in this cup. It is a cup of coffee. And that's the thing about the genitive. By the way, I am talking to Latin 3 here. I mean, if you want Latin 1, you can watch this and try to wrap your head around the genitive a little bit better, but this is really aimed at Latin 3. Latin 1, you can just worry about the Latin 1 genitives for now. But level 3, for a lot of these case overhauls that we're doing right now, I've been going with like the things we know and kind of working out toward the more general and the less specific and the slightly harder to define. But I think for the genitives, I'm going to walk it the other way around. Also, it's so windy and my ear's doing a weird thing. I kind of want it to pop. Anyway, there we go. So, here's the thing, right? When I say that I'm specifying, what I'm arguably doing here is I'm using something called the genitive of specification to specify what this is a cup of, all right? But the thing about the genitive of specification, it's kind of the most generic and broad of all the genitive topics. So much so that in a certain sense, you could actually argue that every genitive is a genitive of specification. It sort of gets at the heart of what the genitive is actually for, right? Because like in Latin 1, I teach you that it's possession. And we don't have a lot of other conversation about it. We say, oh, it shows possession. That's because that's a pretty simple thing that you can point to and it's common and it's easy to use. But even a possessive genitive is still, in a sense, a genitive of specification. It's just the context around how you're specifying has to do with possession, right? Like if I say that I'm sitting in a car of mine, right, or my car, I am specifying which car by expressing possession over it. I can still do that with the genitive, and yeah, it's still specifying the car, even though I'm doing it in this very specific way, right? So yeah, that's kind of what the genitive is, right? I mean, it's an adjectival case. I'm not saying it's an adjective. Genitives are nouns, but they are nouns whose primary job is to have a relationship with another noun to make it more specific. So in the broadest sense, you would just say a genitive is a genitive of specification, but usually there's going to be some kind of context that does make it more targeted than that, like possession. It's specifying by showing ownership over something. Or part of the whole is another one that we already know, where you are making something more specific by saying how much of something else it is, right? By showing a portion in that sense. But let's talk about some ways in which the genitive can modify something that we haven't talked about before. Another way that, you can modify a noun via a genitive is something called an objective genitive or something called a subjective genitive. And these are different from the others because these are instances when you have a noun that is verbal in its nature. It's basically the noun form of some verb, of some activity. And the genitive that goes with it, if that noun were a verb, would either be the object or the subject of that verb. I know, it sounds a little crazy. But let's talk about fear for a second. This is very classically the example that grammarians will go to. Because let's say I have a fear of corruption. All right? Might also have a fear of loud trucks drowning out my sound. There we go. I think it's passed. But yeah, let's say I have a fear of corruption. Right? I'm using the noun fear. And I'm making more specific what kind of fear it is by saying of corruption, which in Latin would be my genitive. But I wouldn't just say that's a genitive specification. We can do better than that. We can say it's an objective genitive, because if I were to turn fear from being the noun fear into the verb fear, I would be saying I fear corruption, and corruption would be the direct object of that sentence. It is the object of the fear. And so, when I say I have a fear of corruption, I'm making fear a noun, but it still has an object of fear, and that objective relationship is shown by the genitive, by telling me what kind of fear it is. And similarly, with those kind of verbal things, with those verbal nouns, you can have a subjective relationship shown by a genitive as well, right? We could talk about, Americans' love of money, right? Now, money in there would still be an objective genitive because it's specifying what kind of love it is, the love of money. But if I'm talking about Americans' love of money, then I would be saying the love of money of Americans, on the part of Americans, by saying Americans love money, because it buys things. It's pretty great. I like buying things, right? But yeah, so like, if I were to say, like, we need to talk about Americans' love of money, right? What I'm doing there is I'm making love a noun, and then I'm having an objective genitive, which is what kind of love it is, love of money, and it almost sounds like Americans is showing possession over that love of money, but really they are enacting the love of money. And that's why it is subjective, because I could turn that phrase into a sentence that is Americans love money, where Americans becomes the subject of love, right? And that can even be a little tricky, because there is somewhat of an ambiguity sometimes with the objective and subjective genitives. Like if we were to talk about the hatred of Seneca, I make no bones about the fact that I hate Seneca. But when I say the hatred of Seneca, you need the context of the sentence to know if the hatred of Seneca is objective or subjective. Like just the phrase alone, the hatred of Seneca, does not tell you if that is the hatred that somebody else has for Seneca, in which case it would be objective, right? I was talking about the hatred I harbor for Seneca. Or if you're talking about the hatred of Seneca as in Seneca's hatred for somebody else, because do not let anybody fool you, that man was a hater. So you're definitely going to be using context clues to decide if, if a genitive is objective or subjective. Again, given that the noun that it's modifying is verbal in its nature, right? But, not all genitives are going to be like that. A lot of genitives really are just showing possession over something or showing a part of the whole. There are a couple others that overlap with the ablative. When I did my ablative overhaul a little while back, I did talk about an ablative of description. I think I even mentioned then that the genitive can do that too. I actually prefer it with the genitive because in English, when we translate them, it sounds like it should be genitive, If I say that this is a coffee of great strength, I'm describing this coffee as of great strength. Using the of makes it sound like it should be a genitive, and it certainly can be. The weird thing is that it can also be an ablative in Latin, but, frankly, I prefer it when they do it in the genitive. There's some other overlaps, like there's an ablative of price. That can also be done with the genitive. That one I actually think makes more sense as an ablative, but personally, I think it makes more sense as an ablative. But it does show up in the genitive too, probably because in ancient Greek it was a genitive of price. So some Roman authors are heavily influenced by Greek. So yeah, I think that basically covers all the new genitives. I guess the only other new genitive that might be worth pointing out is there are some special verbs that take the genitive. We did already talk about that. That was in our textbook. So, but those are basically verbs for the most part of remembering and forgetting. There are a couple other examples. And of course, when I post this video, I'll post examples, with like lists of verbs that do that and also adjectives that do the same. So, hope this didn't get too rambly. Hope this makes a little bit more sense to you guys. But yeah, so I'm going to finish my cup of coffee now because it's getting cold while I've been jabbering on about genitives. And I'm going to drive on to a place where I can upload this video without taking 10 hours to do it. All right. Bye, guys.